Lecture on photographic composition. Photographic composition is the arrangement of visual elements in the camera viewfinder and also the arrangement of elements in the post-editing process prior to publication of a photograph online, in a magazine, in a newspaper, or any other type of publication. Now, we're going to talk about visual storytelling at another time. And visual storytelling is mainly about the content of what's in the photo. But it's how you compose the center of interest within your photo that will help determine whether that photo is plain and boring or whether that photo is aesthetically pleasing to the viewer and helps to draw a more visual story for the viewer. Let's take a look at this photo of then Senator Obama on the campaign trail back before the 2008 election. Now, effective photo composition can be achieved by applying one of 10 time-tested techniques for arranging an element in a photograph. Take a look at this photograph. You can pause the video for a second if you'd like to, but take a look at this photograph. There are two things in here that can be changed that will help make this photo more visually appealing. I'll give you a quick second to go ahead and look for those changes and see if you can find them yourself. Did you notice the guy's head down at the bottom where President Obama is at? He's right here. That's a little awkward to just kind of have a dome of a head kind of sticking up there. The second thing too, you see this R on the poster where it says change? Well, if we simply crop those two things out like this, that's going to help make the photo much more visually interesting. With this photograph right here, we've eliminated anything in the frame that does not contribute to the content and telling of the visual story. This photograph of then Senator Obama was from the 2008 campaign, and notice above the word change that leads directly to him. Again, change was a big thing that Senator Obama ran on back in 2008 for the presidential election, and this helps bring a more visually appealing and also a verbal message within the photograph simply by composing the photo the way that the photographer did. So let's take a look at a couple things that we can do to help compose our photos for maximum impact. The first one is composition technique, and it's the camera position. This is the most basic decision that a photographer makes on every image, and this is where the photographer has to decide, am I going to move close to the subject to add impact and detail? For example, this photo of the young man running, the person either got close or used a telephoto lens to give the visual illusion of being close, or do I want to move away from my subject in order to give a better sense of location and also provide an opportunity to add more information? So again, camera position is the very first thing. Do we want to be close to the subject, or do we want to be further away from the subject? The next is our camera format. With our camera format, we can have our camera held in a horizontal position, like we do here with the photo of the teacher at the front of the classroom, or we can also get a vertical view of the subject as well too. What the photographer needs to do is they need to look at the scene with their eyes and then make a conscious decision on the format of the camera based on the content of the image they're trying to tell. Now, with this photo right here, we're actually framing the teacher in between the two rows of students on the right side and also on the left side. Try to imagine this photo in a more vertical format rather than the current horizontal format that it is in. If we had it in a vertical format, we would lose the students over here on this side and the students over here on this side. And it would look a little bit more awkward, simply just having a teacher standing at the front of the room. Plus, we'd most likely be cutting this young lady's hand in half and we would just kind of have some fingers floating up there, and that would just be really weird to see that. So with a horizontal aspect, like the one that we have here in this photo, we're actually able to frame the teacher between the two rows of students. Let this photo be a lesson to anybody who decides to fall asleep in any class where there is a camera present. Your photo will be taken by someone. I pretty much guarantee it. But this is a more vertical option. Again, imagine this photo in a more horizontal format. We have a person on the left side of the photo here, which we can see by their shoulder and upper arm. We also have a person over on this side that's helping to frame our center of interest in between them. If this was more vertical and we could see more of this person or more of this person, your eyes wouldn't necessarily be drawn towards your center of interest here, which is this young man, bored to tears, getting ready to fall asleep in class. So again, varied formats, when applied effectively, also provide editors with more design options when it comes to laying out newspapers, yearbooks, and even online as well too. So that's camera format. We can do our camera vertically and take a photo, or we can move our camera in a horizontal position and take a more horizontal photo as well too. Camera angle is very important, and this is another conscious decision that a photographer has to make in order to draw attention to the center of interest. This photo right here has a whole lot of problems going on with it. First off, it was taken at the photographer's eye level and straight onto the subject. That means it's more of a boring photo. Plus, look at everything that's going on in the background. We have this black net, which can be very distracting. We also have some workers back here in white coats, and this young lady here in white that can be distracting. Plus, we have the medical worker over here getting ready to draw blood, and we cut her halfway off. So, this photo would have been more visually appealing depending on who the center of interest is. Is the center of interest the young lady giving blood? Or is the center of interest the other two students here in the red that are helping to just keep her relaxed and keep her calm during the blood donation process? If the young woman giving blood here is our center of interest, then the photographer should be back here, aiming the camera down this way to frame her face and also her arm in between the shoulders of these two people. If these two people are our center of interest, the photographer should be back behind this worker, aiming up this way in order to get some elements of this young lady in here, but their expressions and their faces are going to be the center of interest of this photograph. When it comes to camera angle, there are two different camera angles that we can use. They're not on this slide, but I want you to go ahead and write them down. Number one is a very high to low angle, and we call that very simply a bird's eye view. Again, bird's eye view is going to be a high to low angle, such as the photo over here on the left side, which was taken up in the rafters of a school theater. Looking down, this one gives a little bit more of a different perspective of the photograph, with our center of interest, the drama teacher, being here, the student over here on the left, and then the row of students sitting here. But it also gives us a chance to get some more information, a poster, a script perhaps, and some other items on this table here that we would not be able to get if we simply took that photo at eye level. The other one, or the other angle, is a low to high angle. That is simply called a worm's eye view, the opposite of a bird's eye view. That is where we are going to shoot from low to high. And I'm going to go back to this slide really quick. The low to high angle would be if the photographer were shooting up this way to get the faces of these two people in that frame. All right? This would also be an example of framing and getting down with your subject. In this case, in the science class, in the photo on the right side, the student has knelt down to get something out of the beakers, and the photographer has knelt down with them and gotten to more eye level with the subject. That is different than eye level of the photographer. Notice too that the photographer used the two beakers to frame the student within the two beakers, and also used depth of field to throw the background out of focus and the foreground out of focus here in the front of the photo here. This way, the beaker's a little bit out of focus, the background's out of focus, her hand is a little bit out of focus, and that's fine because her face is our center of interest there, and that is what you want to have in focus. Now, I want to talk about a compositional technique called the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is a very important photography and composition technique that you will need to understand. The rule of thirds is so important, as a matter of fact, that all of your photo projects will be required to have the rule of thirds in it. And the rule of thirds is simply, where am I going to place my center of interest, which again is the most important storytelling element in my frame. And we can do the rule of thirds one of two ways. We can place them in our frame by looking through the viewfinder, or we can also put them into the rule of thirds in the post-production process when we crop the photo. So this is what the rule of thirds is. The principle of the rule of thirds is just a quick formula for effectively placing the center of interest within the viewfinder or within our photo. What you do with the rule of thirds is you simply take a photo, and in this case we have a horizontal format photo, and just simply visually draw a tic-tac-toe board, and it's broken up into thirds, thus the rule of thirds. What you want to do is you want to place your center of interest somewhere on the 4 intersecting lines, noted here with the red circles. This keeps you from putting your center of interest in the dead center of the photograph. It will allow you to move off to the right, or also off to the left as well too. So if we apply the rule of thirds to the photo of the young lady with the bow and arrow, we place the subject at a point just outside the center of the viewfinder, and this helps to make an easy location for the viewer or also for our reader. We have her forehead here, and we also have her torso here in the 2 intersecting lines. This allows us to open up over here and have the bow and arrow, along with her eyes, and the way that she is looking draws our attention this way, and we have the open space over here. This photo would not work as well if this young lady were here, because we would cut out most of the bow, and we would have a lot of space behind her, which would be considered in photography wasted space, because it's actually not part of the story that we are trying to tell. So that is simply the rule of thirds. Now, if you have a point and shoot camera, or you're using a phone camera, for example, the iPhone has one, you can actually turn the grid on your LCD display, and you will have the rule of thirds grid right there to help guide you when you place the center of interest in your viewfinder. The one drawback to an SLR camera is the rule of thirds grid is not in the viewfinder. You actually have to visualize it. But again, if you take a photo and you don't have the photo in the rule of thirds, then no worries, because in post-production software such as Photoshop, or even sometimes in cell phone apps that are used for cameras, you will actually see a rule of thirds grid that will pop up, and you can crop that photo according to your rule of thirds grid. Again, the rule of thirds is very important, and it's something that you will have to have in all of the photos that you turn in this year. I should say all of your highlight photos you're going to turn in this year. All right? So again, to achieve the rule of thirds, basically what you want to do is you want to, especially with autofocus, see these points right here? These are autofocus points. This one's kind of hard to see because you lose it in the black of the armband there. There's one here and there's one here. So most cameras have an autofocus. If we were to try to focus here in this area, this is also in the area of the camera that it reads light, it's going to focus on the sky, and it's going to throw her out of focus. So what we need to do is we need to place her on the focus meter here, and then we will shift everything over to place her onto the rule of thirds for proper metering. So to achieve accurate metering and focus without sacrificing the rule of thirds, here's the 4 simple steps. First, you want to focus and meter. That will allow your lens to focus, and your light meter which on an SLR camera is right down here, it will be able to tell you what kind of exposure you're getting through your light. You want to use the camera control that locks these functions. Usually on an SLR camera, if you apply a little bit of pressure to the exposure button, it will lock those features. Then compose the photo using the rule of thirds, and then finally go ahead and make the exposure. Now here's some other compositional techniques that you always need to be aware of. The next one is called subject contrast. Sometimes effective composition can be achieved by simply making sure that there is a strong contrast between the center of interest and other elements of the photo. So in this case, with the young lady who is seen in a play or some other performance, the background is very dark, where her dress is a very light blue. Imagine if she was wearing a black dress or a dark navy blue dress in this photograph. The silhouette of her torso would completely be lost in the background because there would be no subject-background contrast or subject contrast. Because the background is a drastically different color, she is able to stand out in our photograph and be a strong center of interest. Now, keep in mind that subject contrast often requires the photographer to adjust his or her position to change the background in the viewfinder. It may also mean utilizing a little bit of patience and waiting for the background to change when the subject moves to a better position. But just know that sometimes if you take a photo of something that is royal blue, but you take it with a background that's royal blue, your center of interest can get lost in the background of that photo and it will not be as visually strong. The next compositional technique is called framing. We've already seen a couple examples of framing with the teacher at the front of the classroom, with the students on both sides being framed, the student that fell asleep in class, the shoulders on the edges of that photograph, was also framing, and then the young woman in the science class in between the two beakers is also framing. Framing is where the center of interest is framed by objects in the foreground or background, and it becomes the focus of the reader's attention regardless of its size or position of the photo. Just make sure that frames have to be in the foreground or the background. They should be natural and subtle so they don't draw attention away from the main subject. Now this photo is very simple. We actually literally have a frame that we are using to frame her with. She's painting some sort of window or windowsill, and we have the opening there that gives us our natural frame of our subject. The next compositional technique is called leading lines. Leading lines are strong natural lines in a photo, like a pointing arm of the woman here with the young man on the right side, that helps to lead the reader or the viewer to your center of interest. So by using the leading line of her arm here, going up to our center of interest, it leads us to the young man here in this photograph, and it can be a very strong and powerful compositional technique. Lines can really be anywhere. Here we have the woman's arm, but it can also be natural lines that are in nature or man-made objects in the photo that really help, again, to draw attention to the center of interest. The next one is depth, and this is basically the arrangement of elements in the viewfinder that help to create the illusion of depth. It's a very strong visual interest and helps to give a dynamic feel to a photograph. Here we have the young woman who's a cheerleader down at the end of our photo, and we're using a continuous element or pattern with the cheerleaders' uniforms and also with the pom-poms in their hands that will lead us to our center of interest, but also gives a sense of depth. Also, note the use of depth of field in this photograph as well too. The cheerleader in the front of the line here is out of focus. And also notice as we go down the line, it leads us directly to our center of interest. Again, the young lady down here at the end. It basically just gives us a continuous pattern that goes from the foreground to the background. Depth is another technique that is often used in art, in drawing, and painting. So depth is probably something that many of you are already familiar with. Along with depth, we also have a compositional technique called repetition. This is when a scene naturally has objects or people that create a repeating pattern, and it helps to attract the attention of the reader. The great thing about this photo, too, it's not just the pattern of the cheerleaders' uniforms, but notice that the pattern's broken by our center of interest, the young lady in the very middle of the photograph that is looking towards the camera or in the direction of the camera when everybody else is looking in the opposite direction. This, along with the repetition of pattern, helps to break that pattern a little bit more, and it adds even greater visual impact to our photos. The next compositional technique is curves. This is a photograph that we saw earlier in the presentation. But curves, just like leading lines, can also add interest to a photo and place the emphasis on the center of interest. This is another powerful compositional technique. It's often found in advertising that helps to add depth. It helps to emphasize movement, and it also enhances the visual interest of the photograph. Our last compositional technique is called triangles. This is another powerful shape for photo composition. Notice that, let me get my mouse here, if we draw a line from this young woman's head to this young woman's head and then down to this young woman's head, we have drawn a triangle. This is a pattern here that again helps to create a strong visual compositional technique. Portrait photographers have actually used the triangle for a long time in the arrangement of family groups to place heads at different levels to form a more triangular pattern. If any of you have ever had a photo taken with your family at like Walmart or JCPenney's, you may have noticed that they arranged you in a triangular pattern because the photographer is using the triangle compositional technique in order to make the photo more visually appealing and more powerful. Now, take a second and look at this photo. What are 4 compositional techniques that you might be able to actually see in this photo here posted? That's going to do it for the lecture on photographic composition. As always, if you have any questions or need clarification, don't be afraid to ask.